Tigers run is over, which means we have an end of season press conference. We will talk about that all today on Locked On Tigers.
You are Locked On Tigers, your daily Detroit Tigers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of Locked On Tigers. I'm, of course, your host, Scott Bentley. Today is Tuesday, October 15th, 2024. Thank you so much for making Locked On Tigers your first listen. Every single day, we are free and available wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off of your first purchase. Welcome in, everybody. Hope you're all having a fantastic Tuesday. The Detroit Tigers season is officially over, as we talked about on yesterday's show. And so now we shift into off-season mode, which always stings a little bit. Stings just maybe a lot a bit this year, because they probably should still be playing baseball based on how the ALDS was unfolding through 3.5 ball games. But alas, they are not. And after every season, the Tigers, most teams do this in all professional sports, but the Tigers do an end of season press conference with the GM and the manager. In this case, not the GM, the president of baseball operations, as Scott Harris is the man that is in charge and calling the shots and running the show here. And AJ Hinch, obviously, like I said, there as well, answering questions, open to the media. You know, I think it's important to talk about these and kind of read between the lines a little bit, talk about what any of these could mean. A lot of times our media in this city is so great that the questions will kind of segue into potential holes on the roster, right? So, like, you have somebody that asks about, what about Javi? What about Shortstop? Well, like that, okay, well, that's going to transition us into talking about what the Tigers are going to do at shortstop, right? That's obviously going to be a really big talking point this year. So I always like just taking an episode and going over all of these questions. Now, it's a little more optimistic this year than it usually is, but I do think that it is important always to kind of break down this media availability. The organization has it for a reason. Scott Harris doesn't speak publicly too terribly often. We usually only see him when pitchers and catchers report, then right around opening day, then, all-star break, trade deadline, and then now after season, and then obviously again for winter meetings in December. So like I said, Scott Harris and AJ Hinch, one of the big talking points, this was literally a 45, I want to say, minute presser. It wasn't like an all morning event, but they took a solid 40 to 45 minutes, answered some questions, and I pretty much just took notes during it and just had some chicken scratch here of my awful handwriting of what I think were some key takeaways from this press conference. That's pretty much all today's show is going to be, is just dissecting all of these comments and conversations that were had. So one of the bigger talking points, I think, was roster improvements. That's immediately going to be everybody's mindset and going to be what the media asks Harris following probably pretty much every season going forward, as long as he's calling the shots. And then whoever's calling the shots after him will probably be asked that immediately after the season as well. But his answer, I thought, was somewhat interesting here. He said he wants to improve on two main fronts. He reemphasized, as he has done a lot, that the majority of the growth that this organization wants to see over the off season is internally, is from within. He said a majority of our growth has to come from within. He used the word majority. Said too many young players on the roster that can improve this off season, and the internal improvement has to outweigh anything they add externally. Now, I would argue if you went out and added, say, like Juan Soto, you're probably not going to outweigh that with internal development. But I think the sentiment here is fine. I have no issue with, right? And he immediately followed this up with, they are still going to add externally, and they will add externally. And it's not as if they're just not going to do anything and sit on their hands. Like, some people have alluded to. And at the end of the day, only time will tell. I don't know, because of a press conference, what's going to be added, who he wants to add, etc. I don't know. So if you're mad at like the answers here, just give it a few weeks, a couple of months. We'll see what happens in December when the offseason is officially underway here. Said he really pointed out that Harris was proud of the versatility of this team. That's something we've talked about on this show since he took over. Him and AJ both, really since the start of the AJ era. He was somebody that was really big on positional versatility, and that appears to be something that Harris ideology-wise, kind of lines up with. He did admit that they got a little too left-handed heavy by the end of the season, and that they are going to look for a right-handed bat to kind of even out the lineup. And then obviously starting pitching depth has to improve. And that kind of transitioned into a question that was about the opener and the pitching chaos and how successful it was. Is it something that is going to stick around? Are the Tigers going to be, the pitching chaos team in baseball going forward? And that's going to be a systemic thing that really holds and is something that is a mainstay with the Tigers. And he didn't really rule it out. AJ talked about this in this question as well, said that one of the advantages that, and he said this a lot over the last 2 months of the season was, the opponent not knowing what the Tigers were going to do with their pitching staff. So I have a hard time believing that we were ever going to get a super clear answer from this question. And, 48 hours after the season ended. But I just can't imagine the organization is going to be like, oh, this is our full-fledged plan so that everybody can prepare for it in 2025 when it comes to our pitching. But Harris did seem somewhat adamant that they were going to need to add pitching and starting pitching specifically. He did specifically mention that one of the reasons why they want more traditional starters and aren't just going to do the pitching chaos thing forever is you just need innings, which he didn't say, but I'm going to throw in there. Like you just need innings. You're not going to make it 162 plus a postseason with the strategy they implemented last year. But, I think he mentioned, right, that Jackson Joe by name, right, and said that this organization still has so many young traditional starting pitchers that he wants to give opportunities, that they're not just going to completely, turn left at the crossroads of what to do with starting pitching versus kind of what we saw down the stretch last season. So that was something that I think is important to bring up as well. One of the biggest questions on everybody's mind this offseason and going forward is going to be shortstop, and it's going to be Javi. It sounds like he's going to be back. I'm not going to, sugarcoat it. You can go listen to the press conference too. It sounds like he's going to be back. Harris even said specifically that there was a role on the team for him going forward, and there's no reason to suggest that he can't improve. Just mentioned in the previous answer that he is looking for right-handed hitters to kind of counterbalance all of the lefties that are currently in the Tigers lineup and just in the position player group as a whole organizationally. Sung the praises of Trey Sweeney, who's obviously a lefty shortstop, hitting lefty shortstop, which is a big deal and is something that this organization values a lot. But, was straight up about the fact that Javi's a righty that has been really good before, and they believe that he can add that level of versatility, continued versatility, and optimal, righty-lefty balance to this lineup. They mentioned the injury. He had said that the organization is really of the belief that there was that Javi was unable to rotate as much as he wanted to in his swing, that he was being limited. I think the word they used was restricted in his rotation during his swings, but was pretty honest about the fact that Javi needs to, I think the exact quote I have written down here is, be a lot better and demonstrate that he can make our infield better come spring training. Did say that he should be healthy by spring training on the current timeline, but there's a lot of checkpoints that he has to go through over the offseason. So I think the natural question to that is, what does shortstop look like next year? And while they didn't answer that, I can give you my best bet based on the answer to that question. So we'll talk about what I kind of see shortstop looking like in 2025 very early, right? A lot of offseason left. But we'll have that conversation, and then we'll transition right back into the press conference, kind of other questions that were asked of Scott Harris and AJ Hinch. We will do all of that right after this. Got to talk to you today about our friends over at Game Time. Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer you get to first pitch, with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, and views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. Look, there's a lot of great features over at Game Time, and we talk about it all the time. Game Time Picks has curation that makes it easier to save more on sports, concert, comedy, theater, etc. You know, flash deals where they have exclusive in-app only deals that you can get, again, just more money you save on when you purchase these tickets to a game or an event. Zone deals where you can choose the section and Game Time chooses the seats. You can save a few bucks that way. One of my favorite features there. And then obviously your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets and more with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and use code LOCKEDONMLB, all one word, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, everybody, welcome back here. Segment 2, Locked On Tigers. Appreciate y'all for tuning in. As always, making us your first listen every single day. Shout out to the everydayers that do tune in every day. We will, of course, be back tomorrow. The show goes on. The Tigers stop playing. This show does not. We will still be in your eyes and ears every single weekday going forward. I think we go down to 3 at the end of December. But until then, you are still stuck with me. I guess now you can just now watch the episodes. Still 5 days a week giving you Tigers updates, conversations, content, etc. So the immediate question when the Javi quotes came out that I got from a billion different people was just, what does shortstop look like? Is Javi just going to be the everyday shortstop? Was that what that means? Is that what Harris is alluding to there? Honestly, I don't think that this is that complicated in the present moment. Now, as I said before the break, there is a lot of offseason left. There is still a lot of moves that can and will be made. Maybe they bring in some more help. Maybe they bring in some more infielders that can play shortstop. There's a lot that can still happen with the roster as it stands right now, assuming health and that Javi's here, which it looks like he's going to be. I really just think this is going to be a straight up platoon. I don't think this is rocket science. Like I think Javi's going to get nearly every at bat against lefties. Sweeney struggles against lefties. He has in the minors and the majors. I think he's going to get the ABs against righties. We'll see what's added. We'll see what potentially changes, but that is my expectation as it changes now. And anything that happens going forward will move my opinion from that starting point. That is what I'm going into the offseason expecting shortstop to look like in 2025. One of the big questions that's always asked anytime Scott Harris speaks is the money from ownership and whether it's going to be there. We've heard a lot of quotes that are honestly somewhat frustrating over the last year or two over this topic, right? One thing that I think is important to remember with this question and all questions when it comes to breaking down a press conference, which is kind of ridiculous in its own right, but here we are. One of the important things to bring up is that Harris is not going to just show up to the media and be like, yeah, my boss sucks and he's not going to give me any money, right? So we have to remember that. There's GM speak in all of these. He's not going to show up and say Javi just like blows and isn't going to be anything and is going to be awful forever. Like there's nuance here, and we have to keep that in the back of our minds at all times, okay? I want to make that abundantly clear. I probably should have started off the show with that. He said that he expects to get funds from Illich. Said the big quote that stood out in this one was, "We don't chase payroll thresholds, we chase talent." Said that, mentioned how a lot of fans look at payroll because that is a really easy way to get a gauge on how active a team was in the offseason, but said that that's not how the organization looks at it. Says if a player costs money, he's going to have no issue if it's the right fit. mentioned how he will have to make a pitch to Illich, and if that pitch is, good and strong and makes sense for the organization, then he fully expects to have the full support of Chris Illich. Again, all of that is with a massive grain of salt, to be honest with you, but I thought it was worth bringing up at minimum. Just know where I stand on comments like that. I'm very much a see it to believe it person when it comes to front offices spending money, because no one is ever going to talk bad about their owner. That's a really easy way to get fired. Also, and this is the thing that I actually did believe was a somewhat big takeaway from these conversations and from these questions, and this part of the press conference specifically, was Harris had mentioned that if a player were to cost prospects in a trade, they are now at a point where they would consider that. And we've never heard that before from this regime and from this era of Tigers baseball. This system is the deepest it has been in maybe my lifetime, genuinely. I'm a kid of the late 90s, right? When has there ever been a good farm system? There's been good prospects, top to bottom farm. I'm a child of the Dombrowski era of Tigers baseball, where farm systems were a figment of our imaginations. So this is probably maybe again, we can argue until we're blue in the face about like just straight up most talented, but there's a lot of top 100 prospects, and it's easily the deepest that it's ever been. And it's the highest ranked that it's been in decades. So it's good to hear that those type of moves are actually on the table. And we'll talk a lot about those potential moves this offseason, what could or couldn't happen, etc. But it's nice to hear that, this team is not just acquiring prospects like they have been and they have talked about for the last two deadlines, right? Harris has never mentioned trading away prospects. It's always about getting prospects. That's in the best interest of the team. That's a point that you can a time frame that you can point to when an organization flips from sell mode to buy mode, and that is I think somewhat exciting, albeit again grain of salt with all of this. But I think that it is nice to hear that, because that is again something we have never heard before. First base is going to be a big talking point this offseason as well, something we'll talk about plenty on this show. Was asked about Torkelson specifically. I think that came from Cody Stavenhagen of The Athletic, that question. Go check out Cody's work. Covers the Tigers extremely well, as all of our beat writers do. Said, Harris's exact quote was, "I think Tork is one of several players that needs to have a really big offseason." Mentioned that the organization obviously still believes in Torkelson. He's not going to say otherwise, just as I've said with a few other questions in here. It would be wild of him to just be like, we've lost all faith, right? So, it's important to remember that. But I said that they still believe Torkelson is incredibly talented, but also mentioned that every player is going to have an exit interview. And that in those exit interviews, there will be a set of goals that they want them to achieve in the offseason. And I just think it's really telling and interesting to me that he mentioned the exit interviews in an answer to a Spencer Torkelson question. Maybe it's not that deep. Maybe it's just like clearly they're doing it with everybody, right? I'm not trying to just be like, this is Torkelson is getting this exit interview and everybody's getting it. But I do think that it's interesting. He was asked about a lot of players, and the one that he brought up, we're going to sit down with every player and talk about what we want them to improve in the offseason, was with Torkelson. So that's probably me reading far too much into something, but I still would be shocked if they just went into next year and we're just like Torkelson's first base and that's all there is to it. So we'll talk about that plenty more as the winter goes along. We got a lot of time and have a lot of conversations to be had this offseason. Kenta Maeda was also brought up in this press conference. He had mentioned the slow start to the season, the move to the bullpen, and how he improved a little bit. They had mentioned in these, set of goals that they want every player to, meet or achieve by the end of the offseason here going into spring training, that Maeda was going to have a large set of things that they wanted to see from him throughout the offseason to make him better prepared. And I think that that's a huge talking point, because last year, very openly, he didn't throw all winter and just showed up to spring. And that's not like slander against Maeda. He usually didn't. That was a career thing that had been reported. He usually didn't throw much and then use spring training to ramp back up. And that was a common thing in his career. Well, he reached an age this year where he wasn't able to do that anymore. So I think that him being fully prepared all offseason gives me a little bit of optimism. Is it still a grain of salt? Yes, absolutely. Do I still think that Maeda is just going to be a starter next year? I wouldn't put money on that, right? I think that he's probably long reliever, similar to role than last year, but at least the conversation of, you know what, we're preparing him better going into next year. There's a lot that we want him to do. I think it at least, giving him a quote unquote normal pitching off season of prep for spring training, it at least makes the conversation a little bit more oriented to, is this contract salvageable, rather than it just straight up isn't salvageable, and this is probably someone that you should cut ties with. So I'm not saying anything's a guarantee with him. I did not see very much this season that I liked, even after the move to the bullpen from him on the mound. But I do have at least a sliver of hope if he is going to prepare better and work with the Tigers staff and whatnot throughout the winter. Okay. Speaking of the staff, we're going to talk about the coaching staff specifically. We'll talk about organizational fit, Casey Mize, and a few other kind of random talking points that were thrown out there this presser. We will do all of that right after this. Got to talk to you today about our friends over at FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place all of your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. All right, everybody, welcome back here. Third and final segment of Locked On Tigers. Appreciate y'all for tuning in. As always, we are in off-season mode, and today we are kind of breaking down, talking about, trying to read between the lines a little bit, and just talking about the end of season press conference, media availability, whatever you want to call it, with Scott Harris and AJ Hinch. One of the big takeaways I had from this was the coaching staff, the conversation surrounding the coaching staff. I think the world of this coaching staff. I think that we have, I don't want to say lucked into, because it took a lot of effort to get the members of this staff all here, and I'm sure a lot of resources and financial backing as well. But I think it's really nice to hear how AJ spoke of the coaching staff. Both of them mentioned that they want everybody back. AJ said that it's as cohesive as a unit as it has ever been in his Tigers tenure here. And also the big thing is, he said, I would expect everyone to be back. I'm particularly nervous about Robin Lund, Juan Nieves, and George Lombard. I'm not too worried about Fetter. I think Fetter, A, wants to be here, doesn't really want to pitch anywhere else. B, the Tigers would kind of blank check Chris Fetter, similar to, I think, probably close to what they did with AJ Hinch as well. But those three guys are guys that could all get promotions. And that is why this, post elimination to start of, players signing kind of few week stretch here is where a lot of organizations poach other coaches, rather, not players. And, Lund could easily get a big check from somebody to go be a head pitching coach. Nieves, same thing. George Lombard, the team's bench coach, who is a vital part of this operation and gets a ton of credit and has been in managerial talks for years now, like literally like 4 or 5 years now, could get a managerial job at any moment as well. So those are guys that I'm kind of nervous about, but it is reassuring to hear AJ just straight up say, I expect everybody to be back. So we'll see how that unfolds over the coming weeks. One of the big things that I think was driven home in this presser was fit. And that's a really cliche thing to say. So I'll start this conversation off by reiterating that point. But both of them really drove home the point that they're not just going to add anybody to this team. Like, they aren't just going to go add a player just to add them. They aren't just going to spend money just to spend money, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I think if you were to take a shot every time the word fit was said in this presser, you'd be hammered. Like, which kind of makes sense to me. I will say, right? Like, this was a season that was so team and specialist oriented, right? Like, everybody has one or two specific roles that you are expected to be an expert in, and you'll be used in those situations, but you will not be used in any of the others. So I understand the point of driving home fit. That brought a lot of success to the team this year. And I'm interested to see, when we start having these free agent conversations or trade conversations, we're going to have to keep that in the back of our minds that, this is going to be a fit-oriented group. And whoever you bring in is going to have a specific role on this team. And it's not just going to be like, oh, we're just bringing this dude to bring him in. So a small point, a very cliche point, but one I wanted to bring up. Casey Mize, one of the last big talking points in the presser. Harris mentioned his fastball, said his fastball was probably the best it's been in his major league career. That's probably true. Mentioned the high fastball, how he gets swings and misses, also probably true. It's pretty much the only pitch that can consistently get swings and misses from him, which is the frustrating thing with Casey Mize. This is a guy that both of them have mentioned in the past and in this, media availability, that he had incredibly high work ethic and still is unbelievably talented, but there's still a long way to go. And the optimism about this offseason with Mize, if you are trying to view this in a glass half full type of outlook, is that this is the first fully healthy offseason this dude has had in 3 years? Like, it's been a ridiculous amount of time since he has had a truly fully healthy offseason. I'm not sure he's ever had a truly fully healthy major league offseason. So I think he'll be working a lot with the Tigers. Like, I think this is, one of the guys that they're going to keep really close tabs on, and they will probably keep a close eye on him, be working with him very closely, all the coaches and whatnot, and see what he looks like in December. And that will help determine kind of how much starting pitching depth they feel like they need to add, because he's a huge X factor for this team. If Casey Mize starts pitching, like a top end of the rotation guy, which I know a lot of people are kind of, the ship has sailed on that and don't think that it's going to happen. But if, just play devil's advocate for me, if that can happen, this rotation becomes even more scary than it's already looking like it could be going forward. It adds an entire layer of depth that it's lacking right now. So wanted to bring up that. Other random talking points that were just kind of thrown out there. They mentioned the dominate the strike zone mindset. That was obviously the big takeaway from Harris's introductory press conference a few years ago. Man, it's hard to believe it's already been over 2 years. But mentioned that the pitching side of things, the dominate the strike zone mindset, has gone really well. And they're not walking a lot of people. They're throwing a lot of strikes. They're still getting swing and miss in the strike zone, et cetera, et cetera. But that on the hitting side, there's still a lot of room to improve on. That's fairly obvious if you watch this team at all this year, that the pitching's good and the hitting's not really. And I think, when you look at the ALDS specifically, you look at that last game, you look at game 5, it still stings. I don't really want to talk about it, but we'll bring it up to really drive home this point, is that Cleveland had a lot of, people were calling it lucky hits. This is a seeing eye single, or the expected batting average was under 200, whatever. They were putting the ball in play. And when you put the ball in play, there's always at least somewhat of a chance that you're going to get on base. When you strike out, there's no chance that you're going to get on base. And the Tigers struck out 16 times out of 27 outs in game 5. That literally the difference in that game was just putting the ball in play versus striking out. 1 for 12 or whatever with RISP, a whole bunch of strikeouts in clutch situations. So there's still a lot of room to improve there on the offensive side of the ball, obviously. AJ also in this presser made a joke about how he has a long list, a wish list for players he wants to see in big league camp. Mentioned Max Clark, Kevin McGonigal, Theron Lorenzo, all by name, for guys that he wants to see in camp next year. So that was cool to see. None of those guys are going to make the team out of camp or anything, but it is cool to hear that they're probably going to be in big league camp as early as this upcoming spring training. It'll be a fun season next year, man. Hopefully it'll be a lot of momentum and good vibes going into that. Starts with a good winter. Mentioned Parker Meadows by name. Just really cool to hear him specific. Like, they didn't even talk about Riley Green specifically in this media availability. I don't think his name was mentioned once. They didn't really even mention Tarik Skubal. They were talking about Parker Meadows and the improvement and how much he meant to this team. And so I think that was good. I guess they did mention Skubal once. Question was asked about whether he was going to get an extension, and Harris shot that down pretty quickly and was like, we're not going to talk about, publicly talk about what discussions are being had behind closed doors. Lastly, shout out to Raj. Shout out to Rahilio. over at Motor City Metrics, Tigers minor league report, wherever. He's done a lot of work for many different places, but asked a really good question, this one about the Rule 5 draft. And Harris didn't really give too much of an answer for it, but did mention that there is a lot of really tough decisions to be had within the Rule 5 draft, and that is a good sign. That's a sign of a healthy organization. That's something we will talk about a lot. We cover that every offseason. All of the big, difficult conversations involving the Rule 5. There's a lot of talent. There's a lot of young talent that the Tigers have to make decisions on, which means they have to add them to the 40-man roster, or else they can be poached from other teams in the Rule 5 draft. And you gotta make room. You gotta create room to add somebody. So that's gonna lead to some difficult conversations here down the roster, but ones that we will certainly have on this show. That's all I got for you. Thanks for making Locked On Tigers your first listen every single day. Shout out to the everydayers that do tune in every day. We will, of course, be back tomorrow, continuing our off-season conversations. If you tuned in today, first day of the offseason, I appreciate you greatly. We are going to have a lot of fun this offseason. There's a lot of difficult conversations to be had. There's a lot of conversations, period, to be had. This is very far from a guarantee that the Tigers will be back in this decision. They were almost 10 games under 500 after the deadline, right? It took a historical run to get here. There are still a lot of improvements that need to be made on this roster. And I cannot wait to talk about all of those improvements and really deep dive and break down what this offseason is going to look like. So episode 1 of the offseason is officially in the books. Peace and love. Going to therapy's dope. I'll catch y'all tomorrow, baby. Go Tigers.